This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include former legislator, former chair of the State Board of Education, Phil Kirk, NC Policy Watch's Chris Fitzsimon, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and political analyst and lobbyist Peg O'Connell. Well, as we promised you last week, we're going to devote much of this show to a full analysis of what the legislature did and didn't do in the recently adjourned short session. We'll also talk about recent legal actions that impact our state, and we'll ask our panel to tell us something we don't know. So let's get started. There comes a time when you just have to say we're done, Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger said. We're done. Now that we've had time to analyze what the legislature recently adjourned short session, we want to ask our panel to give you their assessment of what the legislature did and didn't accomplish. Phil Kirk, legislative short sessions sometimes drag out, as you know, well into the summer, but this year it appeared the legislature was hot, tired, and eager to adjourn. In addition to revising the budget for the fiscal year that started July 1st, what would you say are the big accomplishments of this short session?
Well, probably the biggest one was keeping it short. I happen to be a member of the legislature during the last time that the legislature met every other year. And it's one of the reasons that I resigned from the legislature, because I was teaching school and knew I couldn't get a leave every year. And I knew with wholesale trend they were going to start meeting every year, and they did. And they had very tight rules back then, and the budget was about the only thing they could talk about. But it's gotten longer and longer and longer. So number one, it was short. The budget was adopted on time, which is a little bit unusual. One of the things they did that they've not gotten a lot of credit for, both parties have neglected the mental health system for many years. And I was pleased that the legislature took $20 million, I believe, of the Dorothea Dix property sales and put it into mental health, particularly beds in rural areas and particularly more mental health services for young people.
Peg, you sort of focus on health issues. $20 million out of the $54 million or whatever it was they got from Dorothea Dix. A lot of people are saying this was just a drop in the bucket. Do you agree with Phil that this was a good move?
Well, it's a good first step, because before that it was zero. And we have neglected, as Phil said, our mental health system for such a long time. So this is a first step in the right direction. Hopefully they'll be consistent in continuing to fund it at more and more and higher levels, so we can get back to where we were before we reformed everything.
All right, the big headlines obviously came from teacher pay raises, state employee pay raises, money set aside for the rainy day fund. But the legislature also poured money into more money into school vouchers and established the achievement school districts for failing schools. Chris, you've been opposed to both of these concepts. What's the impact going to be?
Well, I think it's a further deterioration of the sort of support for our traditional public schools, and I'm still astounded whether you think we need school vouchers or school choice or not. I'm really shocked that we would continue to spend money, and this budget just didn't spend $34 million more on vouchers. It laid out in the budget we'll be spending $127 million a year in 10 years. It goes up $10 million every year, and there's virtually no accountability in how that money is spent, what the schools are teaching, whether they can discriminate against LGBT kids, which have been in the news a lot with HB2. We have schools that are using textbooks that teach silly things as science, like dinosaurs and humans coexisted. I really hope that at some point, if we're going to spend $127 million of our money, that we have some accountability in how this money is spent and what the kids are learning.
So I take it you don't think this is a good idea?
I think it was not a good idea.
Later in the show, we're going to be talking more about HB2, John, but the lawmakers did agree to a minor change in the law, allowing workers who believe they've been discriminated against to sue in state courts, but they put a provision in there that shortened the normal time period for filing a lawsuit to 1 year. What do you think is going to be the impact of this legislation?
Well, that was the right change to make. That change should not have been in the original bill. It's strictly a tort that existed for wrongful termination. It wasn't for general discrimination, and it existed under case law. It had never been enacted. But it wasn't worth messing with. It is used very rarely. It is going to continue to be used very rarely. Almost all such discrimination cases go into the federal system. They get handled fairly quickly. To be brutally honest with you, this was a game between plaintiffs' attorneys and corporate defense attorneys has been game for many years. Sometimes plaintiffs' attorneys would purposefully delay cases beyond the window for federal action and then file in state court because there was some possibility of getting higher damages if your client made a lot of money. But look, I don't think it was worth messing with. I think it was entirely wise to add it back, and you can tell why this was important. Around the country, people thought that North Carolina had taken away the right of North Carolinians to sue for discrimination, which had never actually happened. They had removed a particular tort for wrongful termination, and that just wasn't worth it. There weren't enough cases to justify messing with it in the first place.
Phil, another widely discussed provision that the legislature passed had to do with higher education. They put a tuition freeze on incoming freshmen at most UNC schools for the 4 years that they would be in school. And then they capped the tuition at Elizabeth City State, Pembroke, and Western Carolina at $500 per semester. What impact is that going to have?
I think it can have a tremendous impact, and I just hope that the legislature keeps its word, and I don't have any reason in this case to think they won't, that they make up the difference, because if they don't, the lost tuition money. But I think it's going to have a dramatic effect on those three, and I think it helps parents plan when they know what the tuition is going to be for 4 years.
Peg, another thing that sort of escaped a lot of media attention, wasn't really discovered until after they went home, was the fact that they changed the ballot positions in appellate court cases so that the party of the sitting governor would always appear first. A lot of people said that this was the Phil Berger law, trying to help his son get elected to the Court of Appeals over Linda Stevens. What do you think of that?
Well, that was so ham-handed, but they got away with it. The thing that's really frightening is when you start screwing around with people's franchise and make them feel that you're manipulating their ballots and how people come to the ballot box, that undermines people's faith in their own government, and that's dangerous.
What about the $47 million that they set aside for pork barrel projects? John, you've talked about that in past years, and Republicans have traditionally been opposed to those pork barrel projects. $47 million.
I mean, I like bacon as much as the next person, but I don't think it's worth spending that amount of money on. That was unwise. I also agree with what Peg said about the effects of changing election laws. I would just observe that for basically a century, Democrats rigged it so their candidates were always first. Yeah. And there was never any complaint about it.
But these are supposed to be nonpartisan elections.
Well, I want to point out the same thing. The Democrats had the left side of the ballot for 100 years or more. And now when Republicans change the ballot placement, it's suddenly wrong. It was wrong before, and it's wrong now.
And Republicans complained that it was wrong and said, we're going to do better, we're not going to do that, we're not going to have pork barrel politics.
But
they changed it so that it would be there would be a randomization.
They changed it the year that Phil Berger Jr. is running.
Yeah,
it was wronger under the Democrats than it was under the Republicans.
No, it's wrong under both.
Wrong period.
Wrong
so
period.
they passed this coal ash commission, Chris, and the Governor McCrory took them to court. The court ultimately said that it was illegally done. Separation of powers issues. What finally happened with coal ash?
They had a coal ash bill that I think a lot of folks on all sides thought was pretty good, and then they gutted it and replaced it with a coal ash bill that allows Duke Energy, in essence, to keep 7 leaking coal ash pits in the ground. It changes what Duke Energy is going to happen. I think a lot of people think this was a giveaway to Duke Energy.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what the legislature didn't do.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe. Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our recap of the recently adjourned short session of the legislature. John, some say this session will be remembered as much for what they didn't do as what they did do. In the closing days, it was obvious that there was a schism between the House and the Senate. Was that the primary reason why so many measures were left unpassed?
It was certainly part of it. There were specific, and it wasn't so much as I understand it between the Senate leader, Phil Berger, and the House Speaker, Tim Moore, but there were conflicts between key Senate members and key House members. And there was also a general sense of, if this is going to become conflicted and it's going to take weeks to resolve, it's not worth it, let's just go home. So there was, part of it was the motivation to go home quickly by the July 4th holiday period, and part of it were that some of these conflicts that bled over into other things. So there were bills that might have passed, but because a different bill was going to be held up, let's say a House bill would be held up in the Senate or vice versa, there was retaliation. And so you ended up with a lot of what I consider to be important pieces of legislation that did not get acted on.
Left on the floor. Peg, one of those involved there were a lot of constitutional amendments proposed. Kind of boiled down to 3 by the end of the session. One of them would have capped the state income tax rate at 5.5%. We've talked about that before. What impact could that have in times of recession? And do you think it's going to come back?
You know, there have been several attempts to set our tax levels, Tabor, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, this constitutional amendment. I think that's bad policy. The legislature needs to, they can only bind themselves. They can't bind the next generation of legislators come in the door. But when you put something in the Constitution, it's very difficult to take it out. And we just don't know what's going to come down the pike. You know, so don't charge more than 5%, but don't put it in the Constitution.
Phil, another proposed amendments would have prohibited eminent domain, taking property from private property owners to be used for anything except public projects. What do you think of that?
Well, I really thought it was going to make it through this time because there were some key legislators that were for it, and I was a little surprised that I thought that was the most popular of the 3. I thought it had the least opposition, but I think they just decided they weren't going to pass any of them.
I think this is a good example of what happened. I think Representative Stam has long been a champion of this. I think the Senate wanted to do it, but they put it in the bill with other constitutional amendments that the House didn't like and sent it back. And one of the things that I think is happening, that happened this session, they've always used weird parliamentary maneuvers, but this year it seemed they waited to the last week of the session. They unrolled a lot of these things. They gutted the bill that was totally unrelated, put a lot of other things in it the last week. And so they waited, and then it got caught up in the way the process works. And I actually think it's, whether you like the bills or not, I think it's a healthy development that some people, especially in the House, said, we're tired of doing business this way. Let's have full debate. Let's don't bend the rules. Let's follow the procedure we're supposed to follow.
One of those pieces of legislation that didn't make it was the proposed changes in math instruction, John. We talked about it on the show. There was a big movement to get rid of the Common Core math curriculum. Many wanted to go back to the traditional Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2. A bill surfaced toward the end of the session that would have allowed public local school systems to do one or the other or both. Didn't make it. Was that good that it didn't make it?
I think that will come back in 2017 or something similar. I mean, the math wars are not over. There are lots of people, not just parents, but also some teachers who would like some alternative ways, maybe go back to the old sequence. There is some argument to be made that some students do better in the new sequence and some in the old. So I don't think this is a dead issue. I think it's understandable that it didn't pass in a short session.
My school teacher over here looks like he wants to say something.
Well, the business community was opposed to having the 2 maths. They feel, and I don't presume to speak for them anymore or ever, but they felt like given the choice and so on, it was going to lower the math standards, and we need to be raising them. And I think the legislature ought to let educators make those kind of decisions.
When Chris was talking about some ways of doing business and some of the pushbacks, one of the bills, Peg, that managed to get a lot of pushback was Harry Brown's bill that was going to restrict wind farms near military installations. There's a fair amount of evidence that the House just didn't want that crammed down their throat, even though some loyal House Republicans said, look, Brown's helped us pass some legislation. Is that the reason why you think it failed?
Well, I think part of it it was so broad. Cell towers, anything taller than, I don't know, the Capitol building or something like that. But as you get toward the end, the House got tired of having the Senate play the tune.
I gotta end this session, this segment with this. We saw the retirement of 20 legislators, 13 House members, 7 senators, saying goodbye at the end of this session. Some of them pretty significant leaders. Bob Rucho, Tom Apodaca in the Senate, Skip Stam, Leo Daughtry in the House. What impact is their leaving going to have on the legislature in 2017?
Well, actually, the percentage leaving I thought was fairly low, about 8%. That's one of the lowest it's been in a long time, but I think they're losing a lot of intelligent members in both parties and institutional memory. And experience and some moderates.
John, you've talked about this before. What is the norm between legislators retiring and legislators getting defeated? What is the norm of new freshmen coming in?
I don't remember the exact percentage, Tom, but I think Phil's right that this is really not atypical. It's actually lower than average. But if you look at the individuals that are leaving, you're talking about people who have been leaders, have been minority leaders, or Speaker Pro Tem in the case of Skip and others. So. I think that there is a lot. I think actually 2 years ago this would have been more serious. A lot of the younger members have now gotten the experience that allows them to take over the committees and start driving the train.
Speaking of 2017, Chris, we've talked about some of these bills that didn't make it. There is all indication that some of them are going to come back again. They're going to have to be reintroduced. But what are some of the pieces of legislation you think we might see again in 2017?
We didn't talk about certificate of need repeal, which we've talked about in this show before, which didn't pass. I'm sure that's occupational licensing. I'm sure that's going to come back. One quick side note: a lot of these Senate leaders are leaving Rucho and Apodaca. One thing is interesting: Senator Berger, if he runs again, he started in 2011. So 11, 13, 15, 17, he'll be running for his 4th term as President Pro Tem of the Senate. Folks used to say Mark Basnight was in office too long. At some point, you think some senators will start wondering how long should one person run the House or the Senate. I think that's going to be an undertone at the beginning of next year.
Well, we thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll see video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and our weekly column. Plus, you can subscribe to our free weekly email edition of Spin Cycle. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NCSpin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NCSpinTweets. After these messages, more legal actions.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
You only get one pair of eyes. Keeping them healthy is critical to your quality of life. Members of the NC Optometric Society know this. These highly skilled doctors have the latest technology and the medical training to care for your eyes and the eyes of those you love. Make sure you visit your optometrist for an eye exam on a regular basis. For more information on keeping your eyes healthy or to find the right optometrist for you, visit nceyes.org. Remember, healthy eyes, healthier lives.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
If there's one thing that frames recent legislative sessions, it's been the extraordinary number of lawsuits and legal actions that resulted from laws the legislature's passed. We want to talk about some developments surrounding HB 2, the courts refusing to allow non-government lawyers to defend suits, and another court decision overturning local redistricting. Peg, we talked in the first segment about the legislature not repealing HB 2, even though they modified the bill a slight bit. Shortly after the session adjourned, U.S. Justice Department asked a federal judge to stay the implementation of this law, even as there are lawsuits working their way through the courts. Were you surprised by the Justice Department's filing, and do you think the bill will be stayed?
So first of all, I think House Bill 2 should be changed. The name should now be the Full Employment for Lawyers Act, because House Bill 2 has spawned 5 federal lawsuits in 2 separate federal courts, and it is now employing 30 separate lawyers to work on all these lawsuits. So I'm all for full employment for lawyers, obviously. As far as what the Justice Department did, you know, the ACLU also filed a preliminary injunction when they filed their lawsuit on the same grounds that it's doing harm to the people that are impacted by this law. So I was not surprised that the Justice Department did this, and I do think that the courts will stay the implementation of the law.
Phil, 68 corporations filed amicus briefs or Friends of the Court briefs on behalf of the groups challenging HB 2. What's the significance of this, and what impact do you think it's going to have on the lawsuit?
Well, I've said all along that I thought the law would be overturned. We just don't know when. I'm not sure it has any. I think it has a bad PR effect. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know that it has any effect on the case.
John, in another legal issue, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals threw out the Wake County election districts for school board and county commissioners, saying that they violated the one man, one vote principle. It said the new maps couldn't be used this November, and Judge James Deaver demanded that Wake County or the Board of Elections or the legislature act on it before July 18th. Wake County Board of Elections decided to appeal the decision. Was that the right action?
They appealed to the full bank of judges in the circuit, in the appeals court. I don't know if that'll change the outcome. It might delay things. Meanwhile, someone maybe a special session to redraw the maps or some other kind of remedy. I am an opponent of gerrymandering. I've been an opponent of gerrymandering for decades. This is not the right way to address the problem, is to have a federal court make up stuff. There is no constitutional bar to partisan gerrymandering. The judge in the case, Jim Wynn, our former state Supreme Court justice, basically is in the wrong. I do not think this is the right way to solve this problem, is to invent law that doesn't exist.
Chris, so far as it goes, legislative leaders said there will not be a special session to deal with this. Mm-hmm. All right, so what's going to happen November 8th? Are we not going to have an election, or
well, that's a good question. I mean,
go back to the old districts?
If this judge's order stands, we can't have an election under these districts. It will be interesting to see when the full all the justices of the Fourth Circuit can meet. I think we're going to have to wait and see when they schedule that, if that's going to happen. I do want to say one quick thing about the HB2 thing. It is a big signal when 68 corporations, including North Carolina companies like Red Hat, join a lawsuit. I think it says again that the business community, the larger business community, thinks this law is a bad idea, and I think they're right.
Peg, real quick, there was another legal action that I think that we ought to talk about. A federal judge blocked the legislature from hiring their own attorneys in the magistrate law and said that the Attorney General was representing the state of North Carolina quite adequately. Thank you very much. The legislature couldn't hire their own lawyers. Is this a precedent? Might we see this going forward?
You know, I think that would be a very good thing, but no, I don't think so. The legislature is already putting aside money to hire lawyers to do a million other things. Yeah. So no, this is a one-off.
All right. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
Now we come down to the best part of the show for many of you, and that's the part where we ask the panelists to tell us something we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon, start with you.
I think one of the big things that happened this year we didn't talk about, Governor McCrory unfortunately signed a bill that regulated body cameras on police officers. I think that was that bill was bad, but inside it was a needle exchange program, which I think which was long overdue, which will reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS. I think it'll actually help people get more into drug treatment. I think it's a big deal that North Carolina now has that.
All right, Phil Kirk, tell us something we don't know.
The wine industry in North Carolina continues to grow dramatically. The number of wineries is at 165 now, quadrupled in the last 15 years. We're the 10th biggest wine state producer in the country, also 10th in grape production.
Interesting. Peg O'Connell, tell us something we don't know.
Well, this budget contained a $250,000 appropriation to the Department of Agriculture to set up the Healthy Corner Store Initiative, which will connect local farmers with small corner stores and retailers so they can start selling healthy food in food deserts in North Carolina.
And it's already having an effect, by the way, because there are a lot of like Dollar Generals and places like that are starting to carry fresh produce in their stores. Yeah, good. John, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, traditionally Democrats outpolled their party's presidential nominees in North Carolina, sometimes by hundreds of thousands of votes. The only counterexample to this trend is in 2012 when Pat McCrory got 170,000 more votes than Mitt Romney got in North Carolina. The big question in the governor's race is, can he do something like that again? Because the presidential race in North Carolina is locked up. If McCrory's going to win, he's got to do better than Donald Trump, almost certainly.
You wrote an interesting column on that, by the way. I was going to comment on that. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll take on more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.